So good to see so many great people joining us. I'll just give it a second. All right, we are moving on up in terms of numbers. So I wanted to say hi to everybody who is joining us. Thank you so much for taking the time at a very last minute. And we are really looking forward to the conversation today, but it's, 1 hour is pretty short. And so I'm going to get us started pretty soon. Okay, so welcome to this webinar, which is hosted by Climate Action Network Canada, Réseau Action Climat, and the UBC Centre for Climate Justice, which is called Beyond the Shock Doctrine, Conversation on Tariffs, Climate and Solidarity. Avant de commencer, sachez que ce webinaire sera traduit en français. Donc, pour accéder à la traduction, vous pouvez cliquer sur le bouton Interprétation. Ça ressemble à un globe terrestre et choisir le français. My name is Alex Cool-Fergus, and I am the National Policy Manager here at Climate Action Network Canada. CAN-Rac is a network of 180 environmental, faith, labor, and local organizations across this land working for ambitious climate policies. I have the privilege of joining you from my home of Gatineau, which is situated at the confluence of the Tena-Gatineau and the Kichizibi rivers in unceded Anishinaabe territory. The Anishinaabe have stewarded this land and these waters from time immemorial and continue to care for all living beings here, be they the maples or birch, the mighty white pines, the muskrats, eels, beavers, or birds. Tonight's conversation can seem far removed from the land and water on which we depend, but I believe that if we center our love and concern for the land, for the people, and for the other relatives who depend on it, we will develop better solutions for all. Therefore, I encourage you to reflect for a moment on the land that you occupy, its original inhabitants, and give thanks for their care and their stewardship. Today's webinar is an opportunity for us to reflect on what's happening across this land and abroad, and propose a critique as well as solutions. For those of you listening, please send us your questions as they come up by using the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Over the course of the next hour, I'm hoping we can have good conversation about the root causes of this crisis, as well as the very real repercussions that the corporate solutions could have on our lives, our communities, our water, and our land. Before we get started, I want to pass the baton to Carol Liao, who is the Associate Professor and Co-Director of the Centre for Climate Justice and Chair of the Canada Climate Law Initiative. Over to you, Carol.
Thanks so much, Alex, and hello, everyone. I am the Center for Climate Justice is so honored to be hosting this timely event with the Climate Action Network in the wake of the political moment we're in amidst this climate emergency and poly crisis. And we're so honored to also have our fellow co-director and the great Naomi Klein here too. At the center, we are focused on advancing urgent social, political, and economic reforms to address the climate crisis. We have about 100 faculty and graduate affiliates and are connecting critical research with our communities. I will also flag an event we are planning in April that is the namesake of this event and this book by Naomi, written in 2007 and is now back on the bestseller list. We are watching this shock and awe happening live. And for those in Vancouver, April 26th at the Chan Center, we'll be hosting an event with Naomi called Their Shock, Our Doctrine, a night to prepare for what comes next. So please check back on our website for the latest. We do hope you all enjoy this event with these spectacular panelists. It is a critical time now for mobilization, for action, for us to build community and response. And we're grateful to have you all here to help us make sense of it all as we keep our focus on protecting those most vulnerable, including our surrounding nature and environment, and prepare for what comes next. Thanks.
Of course, I'm on mute. Thank you so much, Carol. Let's kick things off with an introduction of our amazing panelists. And before we get started, I know people have a lot of questions about if this is going to be recorded. Yes, the answer is it is recorded. It's also being live streamed right now. And so you'll all have access to the recording over the next couple of days. All right, so let's introduce our speakers. Syed Hussan is the Executive Director of Migrant Workers Alliance for Change and a spokesperson for Migrant Rights Network, and he's coming in from Toronto. Naomi Klein is an award-winning journalist, columnist, and the international best-selling author of 9 books published around the world, including The Shock Doctrine, as Carol was saying. And she's the honorary professor of media and climate at Rutgers University and is associate professor in geography and founding co-director of UBC's Center for Climate Justice. And finally, Melina Laboucan-Massimo has worked on climate justice, Indigenous sovereignty, and women's rights for over 20 years. She is the founder and ED of Sacred Earth and the co-founder of Indigenous Climate Action. Melina is the inaugural fellow at the David Suzuki Foundation, where her research focused on climate change, Indigenous knowledge, and renewable energy. She is also the host of a TV series called Power to the People, which profiles renewable energy in Indigenous communities. And I have a surprise guest. Okay, so let's get started. There is a ton that we'd all like to cover, but given we only have an hour, and I know that this is a very active audience of a lot of people with a lot of questions, let's start by addressing the fact that we've collectively been stumbling from crisis to crisis over the past years. Meanwhile, we've seen a surge in the right. Corporate profits have concentrated in the hands of the very few. And with this new tariff war and Donald Trump and his broligarchs, we are facing a multitude of shocks. It's a lot. People are scared and it's hard to know how to respond. So what is top of mind for you in this current moment? And maybe we should start with Naomi, who coined the phrase, the shock doctrine.
Thanks so much, Alex and Carol and Hussan and Melina. Just so glad to be in conversation with all of you and really grateful to the organizers. This is an amazing turnout. We have, I'm seeing 655 people just on the Zoom, and then there's a whole other live stream. So I think people are really hungry for this kind of gathering. You know, I really am grateful to all the organizers for stepping into that space and, you know, creating a convening. I think we need more of them. That's a lot of what's on my mind, to be honest. But yeah, just very, very grateful to be in conversation with you. I am, so it's interesting, you know, I actually have been thinking about what the shock doctrine doesn't prepare us for in this moment. In that, you know, I think there's a lot that's familiar to any of us who sort of followed this kind of playbook, right? Like there's a way in which what Elon Musk is doing and the sort of corporate coup of it, and you know, these sort of know nothing young guys running through the government, firing people, cutting off aid. You know, to me, it's reminiscent of the Chicago Boys in Chile, or it was the Berkeley Mafia in Indonesia, or, you know, frankly, like the Heritage Foundation interns that were let loose on Iraq after the invasion. And, you know, but I've really been trying to kind of check myself, because I think that there's a way that familiarity can obscure what is new. So I think there's a lot that is familiar about moments of shock being exploited to push through a kind of free market playbook, and that's all happening, and there's all kinds of profiteering, and we understand that, and we have the Canadian version of it, which is kind of like the aftershock doctrine, which is like, we're going to fight Trump basically by doing the same thing Trump is doing. And you know, Melina and Hussan, I think you have a lot of examples of this, right? Ramping up extraction, more fortress borders. So basically doing their job for them, right? And calling that standing up to Trump and being tough, right? But when I say that I'm trying to stay in touch with what is different, is that I think there is a different quality to this stage of capitalist pillage. I think there's an apocalypticism to it that we have to reckon with. That is intimately connected to the pillage, in the sense that, you know, I don't think that we are in the age of climate change denialism anymore. It doesn't matter what people say. They know that we are in the era of consequences, right? Where all of the deregulation and all of the sort of the grotesque hoovering of the world's resources up to, you know, a tiny elite has all of these consequences, and the consequences are dispossession, and the consequences are the serial climate shocks, and the consequences are just making life unlivable on so many different fronts. And if you think that Elon Musk doesn't know that, you're kidding yourself. If you think Peter Thiel, who bankrolled the right, including JD Vance in the States, doesn't know that, you're kidding yourself. And I think that the way I understand this stage of the project, more than a half a century into, what I've called the shock doctrine, it's not the end of history. It's not Francis Fukuyama's The End of History. It's really like an end times kind of capitalism where it's really all about fortressing and I think that the intranecine battles that we're seeing on the right, like between the sort of, the Christian nationalists who want all immigration to be shut down, and like the Silicon Valley oligarchs who will still want their, to be able to bring in a highly trained workforce from India. It's really a battle over where they're going to place the wall of belonging. Like some people want it on the border, some people want it around faith, some people want it around race, some people want it around money, right? But it is what they all agree on is this kind of survivalist prepper mentality that it's like we need to grab what we can in order to survive the shocks that we ourselves have created. And I think that that's what binds together like the hardcore like religious extremists who actually believe that that this is the end times and there's going to be a rapture and there's going to be like a small group of people who will be lifted up to the sky, and the people who are building their sort of fortress down here, they've all given up on this world. And that's what I want us to understand, because I think that that's what we need to respond to. That's what we need to help people understand, is just the bleakness and the nihilism of their project. And I think that we need to, we need such an expansive solidarity to beat it. And so I guess part of what I'm thinking about, Alex, is I can't think about the successes of the fascist right without thinking about the failures of the left, right? Like, I don't think that we would be where we are if we all were, building the alliances that we need to be building and the solidarities that we need to be building. It's always that the success of the fascist right is always the flip side of it is always a story of failures of connections and solidarities on the anti-fascist side, right? So as I try to understand them, I'm also feeling like I don't want to lose sight of looking in the mirror and sort of being honest about this is not where any of us want to be, right? And that's not like a criticism of people on this panel by any means, but it's just like we, the broader kind of left, right? That we have to be more united. We have to be stronger. We have to be more strategic. So that's just a release of what's on my mind. I don't think the shock doctrine is enough to explain this moment, I guess is what I'm saying. We have moved beyond it.
Phenomenal, because the shock doctrine literally gave me nightmares when I read it. So glad to know that we need to go beyond that now. Speaking of solidarity and cross movement work, I think Hussan, the Migrant Right Network, has published a really good take on the tariffs and what's needed with regards to migrants. And I'm wondering if you can speak a little bit more to that side of things.
Absolutely. I mean, I was listening to you, Naomi, just now and thinking about what's different in this moment. I just wanted to also say, I think what's also different is that we are seeing a much more powerful global South. I think we are seeing a multipolarity really challenging American and imperialism, in which Canada is such an important project. And so in that moment, of course, this, you talked about putting up borders. It's actually also about, an attempt to build the military power to actually cohere together the right, so as to have this, almost end of time battles that some people believe is, on the right believe is coming with China or with India, etc. So I think that's part of what we're dealing with. I think just on this question of, where of solidarity, I think one of the things I really want to think about is, why is Trump doing this? Right. So we hear that this is about trade deficit, it's about bringing jobs back to the US, but we know that in particular, it's about playing to his base, right? It's playing to his base. And so why is it that his base can be mobilized on the question of anti-immigrant values. And then when we understand that, I think, and then why is it that he is calling on Canada and Mexico to strengthen the border, both of which have agreed to do so at great numbers, is that there is a way in which anti-immigration, attacks on drug users, attacks on trans people are serving to really distract and divide the working class away from the fact that we are in an affordability crisis, particularly in this, recession-esque moment that we're in post-COVID. And in it, I think in, thinking about the question Naomi asked in the failures of the left, is we really need to re-understand racism. I think there has been a lot of work done to not understand racism appropriately. So, here in Canada, center-left government under Trudeau has basically passed laws so that there are 3,000 study and work permits that are expiring every day for the next 2 years, right? So 3,000 people a day for 2 years, that's over 2.3 million people will be forced to leave the country. I mean, this is mass deportation, but that was brought by Trudeau, the man who was elected, and his big photo op was refugees welcome, and he was hugging Syrian babies, right? So that's the man who's doing it. We can imagine what comes after. For the last year and a half, actually almost 2 years, everyone in the country, even progressives, have in one way, shape, or form scapegoated migrants for the housing crisis, for the affordability crisis. Many of us believe, and I hear even progressives say things like, Canada brought in too many migrants, and because that's what employers wanted, and they didn't have homes, and so now we need to pause this to ensure that our systems can catch up, and it's really for the goods of everyone. So this kind of misunderstanding about immigration, where really we know it's speculators, it's the lack of rent controls that have actually forced this crisis, has made it that we are not able to really resist when immigration is mobilized to divide the working class. And I think, so, I want us to really think through what's happening here, and specifically in the ways in which individualism is the answer, right? So, what's happening is that when people are faced with these tariffs, what is the call for everyone? The call for everyone is taken up is, I want to buy Canadian, right? I want to act as an individual. And we've done that also, right? Like we've said, your vote matters. Spend every dollar, put your name in your petition, add your name. It's about individuation of people, when what we need has been collectivization. People are struggling. Rent is unaffordable, groceries are high. But the options that we have been providing for too long have been about separating people instead of collectivizing them. So those would be my two things. I think understanding the way in which racism is divided the working class, and therefore fighting racism is not about solidarity with migrants. It's about our collective survival. We have to take on xenophobia as a methodology through which, once we're divided, they can push through pipelines, they can attack every progressive issue. And then second, to figure out ways in which we can act collectively, not individually.
Thanks so much. So definitely there's been a pushback against, more immigration, more migration, and there's a decline. But where there is no decline is in the push for more pipelines and more resource extraction and more critical mineral mining and whatever it is. And Melina, I know that you've spent essentially your entire life, working to preserve your homeland, and also to make it possible for solutions to flourish in communities around Turtle Island. And so I'm wondering if you can share a little bit more about your experience there, and also how that fits into this current moment.
Yeah, I feel like I feel like I was talking to a colleague earlier, and it says we feel like it's like a whiplash, it's like every day things are changing. And so, like Naomi said, it's like it's the same old playbook, but it's a different playbook. And so you definitely see some of the recurring themes of the same playbook of the right trying to exert power, control, domination. But I think one of the new chapters in this playbook that I'm trying to understand is also like the use of not military coups, but an administrative coup, as they're calling it, the asserting control over data infrastructure. So Trump, along with Elon Musk, asserting control over privatizing government intelligence. And that's I think a little bit of the scary thing that we haven't necessarily seen. That was kind of a little bit more hands-off, not fully, but it's the fact that Musk is taking control of that is concerning, I think, for a lot of people in terms of our digital security as organizers, as people that we organize online as well. And so that's one of the things that I've been trying to wrap my head around. Another thing that I feel like that I've been seeing in the media is kind of like these knee-jerk reactions to Trump's ploys around Canadian government ministers and the business community saying, let's build pipelines that run east to west. And it's like this call again to revisit the same old oil and gas projects that have been put down repeatedly across the country, that have been proposed and oftentimes are US and foreign owned. And so I don't really know how that gives us energy security, because that's what they're calling for Canada to have energy security when they, inevitably probably wouldn't be owned by Canada. Not that I think we should build another pipeline anyways. I think what we should have already learned of the $34 billion plus price tag of the pipeline of the TMX, where taxpayers have had to swallow that a lot of times without consent. And then I don't think that really provides us economic security either. So I feel like a lot of what we're seeing is this continuation of a playbook, even here in the North, around the continuation of oil and gas. And then I think, which is something that we need to completely go the opposite direction, where we need to make ourselves less dependent on oil and gas, that we need to not do more of the same that we have been doing for the past decades, which is further entrenching ourselves into an industry that is fueling the climate crisis and is also being dwarfed by renewables while the rest of the world expands on climate solutions. So I think it's really, I just feel like it's just this continuation of politicians refusing to admit that there is a climate crisis and not being held to account to do their due diligence. And I think I just heard on the radio the other day, in such a nonchalant way, that the UN was like, oh, it's okay that countries like Canada haven't put in their climate reductions to the UN. Oh, that's okay. There's still time. And it's just like, no, there's not time. And so I think that's the thing that I see, that's the continuation of the distraction, right? Like of Trump, that he has a distraction and then allows for the fueling of the types of ways in which he can accumulate power and wealth and domination in the world. So I think that really makes me quite concerned, because again, it's going to be the communities like mine, like many other communities that I've worked with for decades, that are going to bear the brunt of the impacts of this refusal and this denial to move away from fossil fuels and to build a cleaner, greener future. That, climate solutions, which I'll talk about in, other parts of this conversation, but we see communities doing this, and yet we don't ever see those stories being uplifted or being used as models or as ways forward. It just seems like more and more that type of transition is being buried, and we just see all of this like circus and charade on the news, and we don't see what communities are actually doing to become climate resilient, to actually survive the climate crisis that a good majority of the world won't, if we don't actually transition in a way that is necessary to address the climate crisis.
So I want to build off of that a little bit, because at least anecdotally, like within my network, I know a lot of people who are simply like turning off the news because it's too much. And there's a sense that there's a real sense of inevitability, right? Like there's nothing we can do about Trump, nothing we can do about the rise of the right and xenophobia in so-called Canada. And in a certain sense, that's a manufactured feeling, right? Like that feeds into the narrative of like, well, I guess there's nothing we can do, and so let's just all kind of calm down and stay home. But we know that it is manufactured and it's not real. So what are ways that you are finding ways, if you are finding ways, to fight that feeling of inevitability? And I can start with you, Melina, or anyone else who wants to jump in here.
I'll just catch my breath real quick.
Yeah, good. Naomi, it looks like you're about to unmute here. No one wants to talk about this.
I mean, look, I would just say it's a strategy, right? It's a strategy. And, I think it's important to acknowledge that people were exhausted before Trump was elected, that this has been, as I was, I was looking up a quote that I had from, years ago from a Polish philosopher who was describing what it was like to have U.S. imposed economic shock therapy imposed on Poland after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And she said that it's like we're living in dog years, like 7 years in 1 year. And I think we've been living in dog years for longer than that. I think that maybe since Trump was elected the first time. I mean, I don't know when we want to start the clock, but certainly if we're talking about COVID, if we're talking about the war in Ukraine, if we're talking about staccato climate crises, skies turning orange, Los Angeles burning. I mean, like pick, and also the genocide in Gaza, which has been incredibly divisive, frankly, like in a lot of these coalitions, because, I think a lot of, and even I'm speaking to you from a university, I think there was like, I don't think activism came back after the pandemic until Gaza. And there was, huge mobilization, but also a huge repression, a lot of silence, a lot of institutions sort of feeling like, well, maybe on this one issue, like if we just stay quiet, it'll be okay. And now a lot of those people who did stay quiet are finding that they're the ones, right? And it, nothing stays static. So in a way, I sort of feel like, I know this sounds really harsh, but I feel like the way a lot of people self-censored around Gaza was almost like a rehearsal for this. Like, I think it's a muscle. Like when you stay quiet about something, if you do it for long enough, you find you can do it about all kinds of things. I wonder about that a little bit, right? So I think it's important to understand that is happening, like those, like there's repair that needs to happen. There's pain, I mean, I teach students who feel such a sense of betrayal from the university because they feel like, oh, like 2 years ago, I was being held up as like part of equity, inclusion, diversity, equity, and inclusion. And now like my university is calling the police on me, and I haven't changed. Like I still am just fighting racism and fighting for the, sanctity of life. Like you changed the rules on me, right? And so I feel like, so I think that we have to understand that people are entering into this moment beat up, like a lot of people for different reasons, right? And I think that, what Hussan was saying before about the failure to understand racism, I think is very, very true. And I think there's also that way in which people are being pitted against each other also crosses racial lines, right? And that it has to do with this exhaustion. And so the distraction machine that is Trump, but also Ford, also, the ways in which people are responding to Trump, like putting on their Captain Canada capes and all of that, right? But doing the same thing is it's like we need to heal some of what has broken, right? And I think if that can feel impossible in a moment where we need to be in such fast forward, but there is a pattern here, and it is the pattern that Hussan was describing, that we have a hoovering of wealth upwards, and we have strategies to divide working people, all of whose lives are being degraded, right? And this is what Trump did electorally too. I've been following Steve Bannon for a long time, and he calls this inclusive nationalism, right? And they're really excited to have built like a multiracial coalition against immigrants. And so, what they're playing into is really how neglected people feel, right? I was talking to somebody who works in public housing in New York City who was talking about how it was possible to get people living in public housing to vote for Trump because the elevator in their building hadn't been fixed for years, right? And this idea of like those people over there are getting benefits and you haven't gotten anything, right? It just shows that unless there's a coherent plan, right, to lift people up, which means that we really have to address the fact that we don't live in a time of scarcity. Like we live in a time of obscene wealth, right? It's just stuck. And, this, what I was referring to earlier about this sort of the prepperism of this moment, right? Of people like Elon Musk and Peter Thiel, I think they really know that this is untenable, like what they have gotten away with, just in terms of how much wealth has been accumulated by the billionaire class. I think they really do understand that either the rage is going to come up at them or they need to figure out a strategy to divide everybody up. And I think they're terrified, right? And that's what this kind of hoarding is about. It's like, we need to like build our fortresses fast. So I think that that's a hint of like what we need to do is like, we really, really need to figure out those strategies to overcome the ways in which we're being divided. Yes, it is about race. It's also about citizenship. The anti-Indigenous strategies we've seen in New Zealand and Australia are coming for Canada. We're already starting to see some of it, but the genocide denialism, this sort of like Indigenous rights means you're going to lose your home. These talking points are all going to be coming to Canada, and we can't be taken by surprise, right? We have to understand this is part of a pattern. And it's really about protecting this untenable level of wealth hoarding. We're not broke. The money's stuck, right? And so, yeah, I know I'm sounding like a very old school leftist, but I think, yeah.
No, and I think that's real. And I also, thank you for listening to Steve Bannon on behalf of all of us. We don't have to do that terrible soul-sucking work. Hussan, do you have any thoughts here?
Yeah, just listening to both Melina and then Naomi again, I think, in terms of sort of the inevitability, my reading, at least, for example, from the mobilizations against the genocide, is that we are seeing this massive upsurge. And so when I am in conversation with, a lot of folks who've been involved in that, I don't see this sense of inevitability. I see this sense of, people have learned how to remain mobilized over 15 months. A lot of my work is talking to farm workers and undocumented people, racialized people who travel around the world, leaving behind their families and putting everything on the line to just make it. And every day people get up, like people spend 16 hours at work and then come to a meeting and not, and then, fight with each other and create democratic decisions and then try to implement them, even as the entire country says they are responsible for the housing crisis and the affordability crisis, and then they go and build the homes that people think they're stealing, and then grow the food which people think they're jacking up prices for, and give care to elders. So I don't see this sense of inevitability. I see this sense of huge power. And I mean, I think the fact that the US and, the money is stuck, this fear that Naomi said, I absolutely agree. There's this massive fear because we are so close, right? I think their fear to me says, okay, well, all is not lost. All is still ahead of us. And I think that even this upsurge of so-called, Canadian nationalism, where people are talking about, as I said earlier, like buy Canadian, it's like people want to do something, right? I think what we need are creating structures of collective work, collective organizing away from individual action. Because if it is individual action, then yes, they'll vote between, Kamala Harris or Donald Trump, or I don't know, Mark Carney versus Pierre Poilievre. These are not solutions. These are not choices. And no other political party in the current system is going to be able to replace those in this moment. So, and our unions, of course, have also been tricked into the same conversation, right? We see unions also, joining in this protectionism idea. We see social movements being like, okay, we have to erase. So a lot of the left, I mean, Trump is an anti-globalization president, right? That this was ours. We were done I mean, Naomi, right? Like we this is our movement. He's just taken it and turned it. And our inability to speak about it and, differentiate between nationalism and economic nationalism and protectionism and xenophobia and like, what does it mean to limit the trade of goods, but not the movement of capital versus the movement of people? Like, we really need to create large spaces for collective gathering. I think if the pandemic actually pushed too many people online, I mean, we never really allowed to do so because our people didn't, but I've seen this. We need to return into collectives. We need to return to our streets. And I think, to be an old leftist, like we have to rebuild the left because we are because the Shopify CEO here wants to be the broligarch to work with the Canada is not immune. Canada is particularly complicit. It's part of the same system. We don't want to protect, we don't want to be like, we're not against the workers in America, right? I think we really need to say this. We're not against, it's not like, we don't want to hurt them. We don't want to buy, like, it's not a choice between which should we then ensure the profits of, Gill and West? Like, that can't be the solution. So I think collective action and spaces for it is necessary.
Thanks so much for that. Melina, over to you.
So much to say. I agree. A lot of has gone online, and then I'm also trying to understand too how we create disability justice within the left, because I feel like that's not necessarily included in a lot of times with post-COVID and a lot of people having long COVID and a lot of immunohealth issues, not only from COVID, but from many other things, being a frontline community member, being exposed to toxic chemicals. There's a lot of issues that people in the left are dealing with. And then also just like, a lot of immuno issues because of doing the activism for so long at such a high pace, and then getting medical diagnoses that render people with immunocompromised dispositions, and then the left just being like, no, we're staunch, and not like being willing to wear masks, not being willing to COVID test still or whatever, trying to make spaces safer for people like me that want to go back into community, because I want to be in community, but that doesn't make me feel safe a lot of times, because the left isn't willing to bring in disability justice along with all the other justices that we need to see in our intersectionality, in our work, in our collective spaces. So that's one point I just randomly wanted to make that I've been experiencing myself. But I think also the inevitability of these manufactured crises. And then I think we've seen, for people that have been organizing for a long time, we've seen this type of messaging before, that these pipelines are inevitable, that building fossil fuels is inevitable, and yet we were able to stop them. And I think that we have to continue down that trajectory, because we know that there has been a change. Previously, when we were organizing against these types of projects, there was an extreme boom, right? And now we're in this bust where we see the International Energy Agency projecting $2 trillion invested into renewables last year, which is double the amount of that was projected for oil and gas. So I know we are kind of on that ability to continue that downward trajectory, even though a lot of what, the broligarchs and Trump and all of the government officials that want to keep, like here, Premier Smith, wanting to keep pushing oil and gas and, keeping us entrenched in this dying industry. I think that we have to continue to, like Hussan said, speak out, not be silenced, use our voices. And it's exhausting, right? It's, for me as an Indigenous person, I don't want to be having to always stop the bad. I want to be building the good. I want to be building our communities back to resiliency. I want to be revitalizing our languages. I want to be doing all of the things that give me joy, and be able to be with my community. But yet a lot of times we have to be on these front lines where we feel really uncomfortable. We don't want to be here, but we do. We put ourselves here because our bodies are the line between the next generations to come. And we have to be that example of using our voices and using them collectively and healing, like Naomi said, bring that healing justice to our movement spaces. So I think that's, I'll stop there and then I'll go on to the next question, have more to say after that.
Sure. Well, I mean, this ties really well into the next question, which is, there's been a lot of talk, right? And Syed, you mentioned it, Naomi, you mentioned it, like the DEI stuff that came up, like there was a whole bunch of like, Black Lives Matter, that was real, that was important, right? I don't know more happened. Like there are all these different things. People are talking about economic reconciliation, whatever that means. And like there's all these different pieces that were talked about, but when push comes to shove, there's a lot of, people who are threatened by what those kind of more collective actions look like and feel like. And you've all spent time working at the front lines and being at the front lines of many different movements. How can folks support and come out in solidarity with people who are at the front lines and who aren't necessarily going to be threatened by this power of the right? And Melina, I think I can start with you, if that's okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's really odd what I've noticed from starting Sacred Earth, about, starting our first initial project and building renewable energy in Indigenous communities across the country, is that we somehow have to justify even to philanthropy that it's important to build these projects. And it blows my mind, that Naomi said the money's stuck, right? And there's this immense wealth in the philanthropic world, and yet we still see the 0.02% to Indigenous communities. I'm sure, Hussan, what is the percentage for migrant communities and in other BIPOC communities? It's just like it's so unfortunate to see the way that when you talk about economic reconciliation or Indigenous sovereignty, energy sovereignty, and you start building projects on the ground, the very projects that are going to make our communities more resilient, it's like crickets. And I just don't see, you can talk a lot about climate action. I've seen, more philanthropy funding climate action, but I don't necessarily see them funding climate solutions on the ground. And that has been really disappointing for me to see, because I feel like it's like you're trying to constantly bring communities, to build communities and be more resilient. And it's hard when you have limited funds, right? So that's been a little bit disappointing, but that hasn't deterred people from transitioning. A lot of times what we've seen even with the current government is that funding for Indigenous communities and programs for renewable energy projects has ushered in policy and frameworks for us to be able to transition some of our communities and build out and be out. Other than utilities, we're like the largest asset holders of renewables in the country. And that wasn't for the faint of heart. That's been a lot of hard work by a lot of unsung heroes of Indigenous leaders that have been pushing transition technologies within their communities that we barely hear anything about. And that was the point of filming one of the, Power to the People, to uplift and highlight these communities that a lot of times I feel like we really despair. And, it's like, it is the shock and awe that Naomi talks about, but we don't actually see the amazing things that are happening in communities, and we don't uplift those stories, and we don't celebrate those stories. We don't use those stories as models. And so that was a part of also putting out the Just Transition Guide to show, like, this is 10 years of research that we did to be able to transition communities, a guide that I wish I had when I put up my first project over a decade ago. And I feel like a lot of times we fixate on the quote unquote manufactured inevitability, but yet we're talking about climate solutions, but I don't see a lot of us implementing them at this point in time. And we need to be at the implementation phase of the climate crisis, addressing the climate crisis, not just, the talking about it and trying to convince people that it's an issue. We just need to kind of, what we've done is just put our head to the ground and just build. We just want to build at this point. And that's, for me, that's what kind of has helped with my climate despair and my frustration with the politics of the right and the left.
I love this. We've talked about this before, but I just wish we could all just like do those projects. And so if you're hiring, Melina, I'm interested. Hussan, why don't you go ahead?
Sure, thank you. I mean, I think, okay, so let me see. In terms of sort of how to meaningful create solidarity, I think the first thing is we have to understand who is being targeted and how, right? And understand, because a lot of it is obfuscated. I mean, we talked about the ways in which 3,000 study and work permits expiring in this country. That is a massive, massive deportation structure that's about to start. But also, trans people, the way in which drug users have been targeted, Indigenous people, and this collect, by the divisiveness of it. So the other thing I want to really stress is that this is, the idea of solidarity suggests that this is happening to other people. But if we understand that this is a strategy through which all other attempts are happening to, to suck up the wealth, to divide the working class, and to make the rich richer. I mean, Elon Musk made $170 billion in a month after Trump's election. The CEOs in this country made 211 times more money, in the first month of their so we have to understand that this is about self-interest. I want to say to everyone here who's listening, it's like, oh, I'm not being targeted. I'm not asking you to be in solidarity with us. I'm asking you to do this for your survival and the survival of the whole of humanity. And so then the question is, because then it's the what, right? So the what, I think, is we have to talk about a different economic system. We have to talk about the Green New Deal again. We have to talk about the ways in which we don't want the ways in which the ruling class in Canada is going to use this moment to enrich itself, right? So we have to propose an alternative economic system. And then how? And so the how, I think, is to organize as workers, not consumers, as the producers of wealth, as the people who are at the, who can actually block the flow of capital if we put our bodies and our collective work towards it. And because then we can actually be in solidarity with the working class in the US and in the global South, as and so I think those are the four things that I would think about in solidarity. Just off the top of my head. Thank you.
Just off the top, those are pretty good solutions. Naomi, are you able to top that?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that is exciting is, there have been big shocks and crises before. I don't think that there's been as much sort of readiness in terms of like, okay, what do we want instead? 10 years ago exactly, we launched the LEAP manifesto, which was kind of a proto Green New Deal, and it was 60 organizations in a room together, hashing out a sort of a vision of a yes. And I remember this sort of a feeling of how rusty we all were in doing anything other than coming together to say no to something, right? Like that we've done that lots of times with free trade deals, the ultra globalization movement, Harper, like we knew how to come together in coalitions of no. But the idea of sitting together like across some serious differences and thinking, okay, can we agree on some sort of scaffolding of a yes? It was just like, we were like little babies, like our feet, like we just didn't know how to do it. It wasn't a skill we had developed. And I've been very impressed with how many people are like putting out policy papers and being like, okay, this is how this is what we do right now, including, Hussan has done so. Like Melina's work is like a living example of what the alternative is. And, it should be funded through reparations, in my opinion. I don't believe foundations are ever going to sustainably fund this. But Indigenous communities are being pushed into situations of having to go in on more and more polluting extraction because it's the only way to fund essential services. That's wild, right? We should not be here. And so I think there are all these different models. The Canadian Center for Policy Alternatives came out with a what did they call it? Maybe we can put in the link. The dozen radical ideas to fight the tariffs, investments in the right to repair, the care economy, lots of things we can do from here instead of just building pipelines that, for a product that the world doesn't even seem to want anymore. It takes a really long time to build a new pipeline. China is moving off of oil and gas, it seems. So what's amazing is that the same US oil companies are gaining from both sides of this. We have to understand they're gaining on the US side from Trump and all of his giveaways. And then the same companies are coming to Canada going, and this is why we need to have that LNG terminal and that natural gas pipe, and that oil pipeline. So, they're winning on both sides of the border. And we have this sort of charade of a fake fight, and this nationalist fight. I don't think that and there's a question about whether or not we can sort of harness this patriotism. I frankly believe that we fight hyper-nationalism with internationalism. I don't think we can beat the Americans in the game of patriotism. I think they've got us on that, nor should we try. I do think that there are things that we can be proud of as Canadians. And, not because of sort of Captain Canada, but because of the kinds of struggles of working people in the past. Our healthcare system has been ravaged, but I'd rather have ours than theirs. And I think we should rebuild ours. And I think it should be equitable in a way that it never was, because it never reached all of Canada. But I still would defend the idea of universal public health care any day of the week, not from a patriotic perspective, but from the perspective that policy is an expression of our values, and whether or not we're going to throw people away, and whether or not we think that, we should commodify every aspect of life, including illness. I don't, and I think we should be expanding those types of values to other aspects of our life. So I think we should, it's a tough time to defend a lot of those things that do make us different from the United States, that are a result of that sort of collective struggle, because after many decades of neoliberalism, they are shells of themselves, right? So they're harder to defend, and that's been a strategy. So we have to understand that that's a strategy. But like I said, I think we are not hurting for yeses right now. Like, I'm seeing a beautiful constellation of yeses coming from different, policy shops and grassroots organizations, and people really stepping into this breach going like, we know what the alternative is, right? And it's not more pipelines and more extraction. But I also think we have to be real that, like I said, they're preppers. And what they're trying to figure out is what they need inside their bunker. Okay. And when Trump talks about Greenland and Canada and our water, he's thinking like a prepper. Like, I know it's easy to just dismiss it and say, oh, he's sort of crazy talk or whatever, but like, he's actually thinking, okay, we're about to pull up the drawbridge. And I think they're imagining a future where there's like a few great powers, right, that are going to sort of do what's necessary to protect themselves. And I think they're thinking about so-called critical minerals and water and oil in Canada as part of the prepper plan. So I think it's very urgent that we really understand that this is different. That's coming back to where I started. That we do have the ideas, but if we're going to fight this, we need to be so much stronger than we are right now, and so much more united. We have to be willing, honestly, think about the trucker convoy and the way they brought the Canadian economy to its knees. I know it's not an example that people might expect me to use, but that was they actually showed that it's possible to do. Okay. And so I think that we're going to have to invest in coalition in a way that we haven't in a long time. Our experience we've all been part of these different coalitions in the past. It's one thing to bring people together for like a one-off, but if we're not really investing in the glue that holds movements together, everyone will just go off into their corners again, right? And we'll feel weak again. So I don't know exactly what that looks like. Maybe it's membership-based organizations. The unions used to play more of a role in investing in that kind of glue and just providing the kind of backbone movement infrastructure, and they're not anymore. But we can't do this without that. So I think that has to be part of what we're thinking about, is not just how do we come together, but how do we stay together? How do we make sure that we don't just all just go off again? And that's, I think, very going to be incredibly important.
A lot has been said tonight, and I so appreciate having the three of you share your time and your thoughts with us. And it's I'm oddly feeling more optimistic than I was just about an hour ago, and so I really appreciate it. I know that there are tons and tons and tons of questions, but I also want to shout out to everyone who's taken the time. There's about 700 people listening in right now on Zoom. There's people listening into the live stream. I think it shows that we are able to jump into things relatively quickly, right? And when time gets tough, like it is possible for us to still build relationships with one another, even though we, maybe have fallen out of that habit over the past years. And so thank you so much, everyone, for joining us for this conversation. Couple of final words. One of them is just that I would encourage everyone who is attending this call to be brave, to make your voice heard. There are reasons why progressives have been sidelined for such a long time, and I think that many of them are not of our own doing. But one of them is that we are made to feel like our opinions aren't valid, or they're too radical, or they're too whatever. Speak out. Don't let them get you down. And so I have a couple of suggestions for people if you're not sure where to begin. And I'm going to be sharing the links in the chat, and I'll also share them in the recording, or rather in the email that's going to come out over the next couple of days. So 350 Canada, they're encouraging people to share their stories of climate grief or climate catastrophe, but also to reach out to federal politicians to call for people-centered solutions through their All of Us campaign. The Migrants' Right Network has a campaign called Rights Not Cuts, which I will also share the link to, and I encourage you to also share within your networks. And then finally, Pledge for Canada, which is kind of a coalitional space, is considering hosting a day of action to fight the tariffs and to harness this energy and this fear to move towards more progressive solutions. And so if you haven't already signed the pledge, if you do so, it will help keep you up to date with regards to their plans as well. So I encourage you to stay tuned to these organizations and to more. This is a continuation of a long fight, and we need to take care of one another and ourselves. So the more we coordinate across movements, across groups, across neighborhoods, I think the better it's going to be. And so I encourage you to keep up this resilience, keep up these conversations. Thank you so much for participating. To Melina, to Hussan, and to Naomi, thank you so much for all of your thoughts. And folks, you'll definitely be hearing from us again. This is not over, but in the meantime, please take care. Have a good evening, everyone.
Thanks, everybody. Are we out or are we saying goodbye?
We are saying good.
Oh.
The recording has stopped.
Oh.